So that's something that you notice when reading this book is everything you see, like kind of the anti-trans from like a quote-unquote progressive or feminist side, nothing is new. It's all just like repeating these ideas from decades ago.
Hi everyone. I'm so excited to share with you all our first ever guest episode of Odium Symposium. This episode focuses on Janice Raymond, and in particular her foundational transphobic and transmisogynist work, The Transsexual Empire. We see how this supposedly feminist work is actually steeped in misogyny, and as usual, we confront ideas that, despite being obviously wrong decades ago, still very much haunt us today. I hope you all enjoy.
There's really nothing real. There is no real. And that's what's called the postmodern mentality.
I couldn't resist the worst racist remark.
The adventure of life justifies its suffering.
I don't want to see him having political succubus with goblins.
We'll do it live.
Okay. Is Trump going to have babies with a goblin?
We'll do it live.
And turn against us like Darth Vader?
Do it live.
Now listen, you calling names you in your goddamn face, and you'll stay plastered.
I was going to have a guest speaker, but the person I had invited in died.
Some level of masochism.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen.
I'm Sarah.
Welcome to Odium Symposium,
a podcast about the production of bigotry.
Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. Largely the format will be the same, but we actually have our first ever guest. So I want to welcome onto the pod Julia Cameron, who's an educator and writer based in Boston.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Sarah and Helen.
Yeah, so we'll get into the topic for today and all that, but before we do that, we have a little bit of podcast business. We have another patron to thank, so thank you to Chase for subscribing.
Thank you for becoming an Odium connoisseur. You can go to the Patreon and subscribe for $5 a month. You'll get early access to episodes. We'll mention your name on the podcast, and you can leave a message. We'll read that out. We forgot to mention that that's the thing you can do, but you can do that.
Yeah, so today we're going back into books about misogyny written by women, right? We're continuing our sort of diversity push on the pod to have, women's voices and centering women's voices on Odium Symposium. So I wanted to get our guest Julia on because she's also familiar with this text. She'd also read it before, and she's done a lot of other background reading and knows sort of about the history of this in sort of complementary ways that I do. Like, we've both read about stuff related to this, but it felt like, okay, we both have sort of slightly different backgrounds here, and so it'll be helpful to get into really why this text sucks. So
what text are we reading? I wasn't actually told.
So the text today is The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male by Janice Raymond.
Oh, lovely. That's so exciting.
This is going to be another game of please don't punch your computer, Sarah. I don't want you to have to buy a new computer. Probably at one of the more difficult levels that we've seen before. Okay. So Sarah, important question.
I'm ready. I'm not ready.
Do you know what a transsexual is?
A transsexual is a person of gender, I would say.
Exactly.
Do you know when transsexuals were invented?
Transsexuals were invented, well, accounts vary. Some say it was in 2014.
I think 2014 was when they invented transgender people, actually.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. Which is kind of around the rise of sort of pre-woke, some of the roots of woke. This is an intellectual podcast, so we like to trace down the intellectual paths that various ideas have come from. And so, my rigorous analysis leads me to conclude that probably about 2012 is good for transgenderism, but transsexuality goes back a little bit further, probably to the invention of the movie Tootsie.
What's funny is that one of the big points of contention here, is this history? And we're joking, but she does place the invention of transsexuals, basically, in the 50s with Christine Jorgensen. She really wants to say, this is the invention of the transsexual. And in fact, this book, so just starting with a little bit of historical context, this book was written in 1979, and very soon after this book came out, and already there was people talking about this, but in the next decade there was a big push to switch over to this word transgender, and there was a lot of things, we'll get into all of that, but a later publication of this book does have a new introduction to try to address sort of cultural changes, and it is advertised as a new introduction about transgender, and it's just it's so weak, it's so funny. But anyway, Julia, do you want to do a brief history of the 20th century transsexuality? Tell us about who Hirschfeld and Harry Benjamin were?
Yeah, so Janice Raymond actually wasn't off by too far. She was only off by about 2-3 decades or so. So, okay, you can look back in history, you can find people that today we can recognize as having something that rhymes with the trans experience. But transsexuality as a medical idea originates in the around 1930 or so, right? So this was, 1910s, 1920s. Scientists were starting to learn what hormones were. And so you could do great things, like you could have someone implant a monkey testicle onto you to give you extra virility and like extra manliness, really, right? Didn't work, but what you can do is if you remove testicles from someone, then that will stop the testosterone production, right? You can produce like synthetic versions of these hormones you can give to people. It turns out the human body is very responsive to these things. And around the same time in the 30s is when these surgeries were invented. So this was done at the Institute for Sexual Science, Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft in Berlin. This was in the 1920s and 30s. The guy who ran this institute, Magnus Hirschfeld, was a beautiful gay man who was really all about just making a space for all of that. So there's a lot of scientific side of things. There's the study of this, a lot of work trying to destigmatize these things. Also, it was a place where a lot of gay people, a lot of what we would now call trans people, would hang out. You go to the nightclub, and then you go to the institute. You go to both of those. So, Helen, Sarah, either of you want to say why the institute no longer exists? What happened?
Well, you may have heard of this thing called the 1930s that happened at some point. I'm not sure exactly when. Most people date it to like pre-50s. And in the 1930s in Germany, the Nazis, one of the first things they did was they took it upon themselves to efface and obliterate all understanding of what we would describe today as like sexual diversity, gender diversity, that sort of thing. So some of those book burnings, those famous book burnings that you see photos of in histories of the Third Reich, those were of Magnus Hirschfeld's research and books and the collection at his institute.
Yeah, so probably in your history textbook you see the famous Nazi book burning where the youth groups had all these books, and what they don't tell you is they had raided the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft and taken all the records, taken all the library, taken all that, and just burned it. Hirschfeld, luckily, was out of the country at the time on a tour, kind of speaking as, intellectuals do. So he survived, though he died a few years later. Transsexuality, though, did not die with the Institute. So one thing this institute was very international, a lot of people would visit, and one of the people who visited was Harry Benjamin. Harry Benjamin, later ended up in America, and in the 1950s kind of kept going with this work. So, as kind of mentioned earlier, Christine Jorgensen was kind of this big first one, this GI from World War II turned bombshell is I think how the headline puts it, the famous headline. She got her surgery done in Europe, right? But this was kind of also being developed in America in the 50s and 60s, and so there were these clinics being developed. So, there was this demand for this surgery, for these procedures, as there was at Hirschfeld's Institute. People came, they're like, I want this, I heard you can do this, will you do this for me? And they wanted to kind of try to study these people. They're psychologists, they love studying a deviant population. And they also, didn't want to get sued, so they had to come up with diagnostic criteria, things like that. So these clinics became a way to just kind of filter who got this, who didn't, who's a true transsexual versus just someone with a fetish, try to work out that. And it kind of built up this academic study started going. So it was this hot topic, and if you're a grad student and you're looking for a hot topic for your dissertation, one thing you can do is you can take the ideas of your dissertation advisor and you can apply them to this hot new topic. So that's what Janice Raymond did. She was a PhD student under Mary Daly, this feminist theologian, and her dissertation topic was, what does this have to say about transsexuality? And okay, so that's kind of one strand as to where Janice Raymond is coming from, is this kind of academic side. There's this lot of study, it's obviously of interest to feminists, let's kind of try to study that as well. There's a second strand, and we'll see this towards the end, which is Mary Daly, Janice Raymond. These are both feminists. There's the academic side of this, but there's also the political activist side of this. And trans people were being involved in feminists. So the historian Susan Strikers pointed out that in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of trans people who were getting active in feminist movements. A lot of these people weren't just like focusing on maybe their own issues, but also working with like gay and lesbian groups or feminist groups and so on. And even though there was a reactionary backlash in the 70s and 80s, you know, this is kind of still there. And so a good example of this would be Sandy Stone at Olivia Records. This was a feminist recording studio, you know, all women trying to like record music by women for women. So like, you know, Four Non-Blondes, Indigo Girls, Chapel Roan, things like that. And you know, they found a recording engineer, Sandy Stone, the transsexual, and she worked with them, and this was a little bit of a controversy. So this was something that feminists were talking about at the time, kind of in this activist political sphere as well.
There was, completely unironically, like, sort of a campaign to cancel her, right?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
But yeah, let's get into the book then. So she opens with kind of scene settings. This is like the very opening of the preface to the first edition of the book.
Transsexualism has taken only 25 years to become a household word. It is likely that most of us were initially made aware of the topic with the publication of the famed Christine Jorgensen case in 1953. A little over a decade later, Johns Hopkins Hospital announced that it would become the first American medical institution to devote itself to the performance of transsexual surgery on a select but serious scale. In 1974, the subject again received notice with the publication of Jan Morris's Conundrum. The latest transsexual notable has been Renee Richards, who has succeeded in hitting the benefits of sex discrimination back into the male half of the court. The public recognition and success that it took Billie Jean King and women's tennis years to get, Renee Richards has achieved in one set. The new bumper stickers might well read, "It takes castrated balls to play women's tennis."
So you're getting a little bit of the vibe we're going to see here with that.
She's so proud of herself all the time in this book.
I know, I'm doing like a jerk-off motion to the camera reading that last line. Like...
And you can feel this like grievance, right? This sense of offense at, oh, they're moving too fast, right? Like,
yeah, it's very reactionary, like overtly.
Yeah, despite supposedly coming from this radical feminist position. And just the metaphors here, her sort of sustained metaphor, hitting the benefits of sex discrimination back into the male half of the court is just so lame.
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know how revealing this will end up being, but she is kind of framing gender conflict as this game with predefined rules. And there's a way you're supposed to play it. You're supposed to, like, shoot the advantage back and forth, you know? Each side trying to get what they want. And here's this person who's breaking the rules, who's cheating. That's very reactionary, that framing.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so she's said, like, transsexualism. It's only taken 25 years to become household word, and it's like, well, what does that mean? What are you counting from, right? She's counting from Christine Jorgensen to when the publication of this book is, but surely there's more history there, right? So it's the other sort of big impulse, which is like, oh, these people just showed up a second ago, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, no, there's a whole history, and there's a whole, you know, there's 20 years before that, and it just doesn't make any sense. And it is, again, a reactionary impulse we've seen again and again to, like, pick a really convenient moment to start your story and just ignore everything before that.
For the record, Raymond does know that the history before this exists. She mentions it later in her book, so...
She knows all this, and she's going to talk about it. It's just, rhetorically, she doesn't want to admit it.
This book is not only a book about transsexualism. It goes further and considers the context that makes transsexualism possible. Oh, moral decay. Oh, I love it. While various individuals have looked at the issue of transsexualism, very few have ever really seen it. Transsexuals see themselves as women, parentheses, men, end parentheses, quote, trapped in male, parentheses, female, end parentheses, bodies. Doctors fixate on hormonal techniques and constructed genitalia, artificial vaginas, breast implants, and the like. Therapists view transsexualism as a humane solution to the agony of, quote, gender dysphoria, end quote. The public sees the media's image of the talk show Transsexual, which beeps out a benevolent picture of the transsexual experience. Many women see the transsexual who claims to be a lesbian feminist as the man who has paid the ultimate price of manhood in a patriarchal society, giving up his balls. All these perspectives are fragmented and ultimately blur the issue. They are like the vision of a deer at night who, facing an oncoming car, is hypnotized by the headlights and fails to see the approaching automobile. They focus on the foreground of the transsexual phenomenon, rather than on its multidimensional background. My purpose is to depict the wider environment in which transsexualism is created, and to do a truly ecological analysis.
How are you feeling, Sarah?
Okay, so first off, the thing I highlighted at the beginning, I can really see, this moral argument coming. This claim that, what's happening is degeneracy on some level. It's interesting that we should start the episode by calling back to Magnus Hirschfeld and what happened to him with the Nazis. A little bit of a connection I'm seeing there between the purity politics and the anti-degeneracy politics of the Nazis and what's going on here. Second, I'm really curious as to whether her background as the advisee of a theologian is going to play into that.
Both of those will come out.
Okay, great.
Mary Daly's book that she cites a couple times here is called Gyne Ecology. There's a slash in the middle, and so she's really responsible for this notion of the ecological analysis, which...
But we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
We have some excerpts from Mary Daly to accompany Janice, Raymond.
I cannot stress enough how many footnotes in this book are just author conversation with Mary Daly.
I see. Okay.
But yeah, a lot of other things to pick apart in this.
What is the automobile? We're deer in the headlights, right? We're about to get smacked by some deadly force. What is the deadly force? What's supposed to happen?
This is Enoch Powell talking about how the river is foaming with blood, right?
It is, yeah.
There's some threat, and it's just unclear entirely. And then the description of what's happening, I would say that depictions of trans people on talk shows, it was not great for a number of reasons, but for reasons very different, right? This picture she's painting, which is, and this is something we're going to see more of, which is therapists and the medical establishment and the media are all conspiring to give the public an image of the transsexual, which is a bad image, which doesn't actually portray what the trans experience is. And she can see that, and then she's just totally backwards on what that means. So here's her main argument. She sets this out in the introduction.
Under the heading, the ontological argument, for those who get that reference.
Okay, I'm Anselm-Pilt. My main conclusion is that transsexualism is basically a social problem, whose cause cannot be explained except in relation to the sex roles and identities that a patriarchal society generates. Through hormonal and surgical means, transsexuals reject their, quote, native, end quote, bodies, especially their sexual organs, in favor of the body and the sexual organs of the opposite sex. They do this mainly because the body and the genitalia especially come to incarnate the essence of their rejected masculinity and desired femininity. Thus, transsexualism is the result of socially prescribed definitions of masculinity and femininity, one of which the transsexual rejects, in order to gravitate toward the other.
So basically what she's saying then is transsexualism is a social phenomenon, just coming out of this patriarchal society and these strict gender roles that produces this. So rather than being biological or something, it is a social phenomenon. And then a page later she keeps talking.
Furthermore, chromosomes are only one defining factor in the context of the total history of what it means to be a woman or a man, in a society that treats women and men differently on the basis of biological sex. This means that the integrity of the body must also be placed in the context of the integrity of the total person, which includes the realization of such values as choice, awareness, and autonomy. Finally, if the transsexual answer reinforces the foundation of sex role oppression, which is sex role stereotyping, by encouraging the transsexual to conform to those stereotypes, then it is also violating the integrity of the society. Transsexualism is a half-truth that highlights the desperate situation of those individuals in our society who have been uniquely body-bound by gender constrictions. But it is not a whole truth. While transsexualism poses the question of so-called gender agony, it fails to give an answer. I hope to show that it amounts to a solution that only reinforces the society and social norms that produce transsexualism to begin with.
Right, so we're getting a little bit of a peek as to what her solution to the transsexual problem is going to be.
Have you tried just being a faggot.
That's not quite her solution, I would say.
Okay. It's at least closely connected. I can see that.
It's close. Yeah.
Just a couple days ago, we got another, like, will no one protect effeminate boys? Like,
thank you, The Atlantic.
In The Atlantic, like, 50 years after this is written, so it's kind of like, we're still stuck in this, right? And it is related to that impulse, and we still see that all over the place. I just love pointing out when these people are also bad writers. Like, it's not as important as the bigotry, but this phrase so-called gender agony is really funny because gender agony is not really like a widely used term.
Yeah, I've never heard that before.
So saying like so-called gender agony, it's like, yeah, you're making up a term and then you're
calling it ridiculous. Yeah.
And this is pretty standard fare among anti-trans people, right? Is they seize upon someone has some influence turn a phrase and they seize on it as if everyone's using it, right?
Right. And just to amp that up, she actually comes up with a bunch of terms. So
yeah, so we need to talk about terminology.
She has a bunch of terms, right? Because she's going to talk about transsexuals, but she doesn't want to cede the ground of calling trans women women, right? Like, obviously, she's opposed to that.
I saw earlier that she had such like a strong negative impulse toward calling trans women women that she insisted on like putting these little parentheses and saying like men actually afterward and vice versa.
That's a little different. I thought that's what that was at first, but she was saying women and she's saying or men, right? So she's saying the claim of transsexuals is that they are women or vice versa, men trapped in male or female bodies. But no, she's actually much, much more awkward because she doesn't want to talk about, right? She knows she'll give the game away if she says these are, like, she can't really talk about it if she says men because she needs to actually address the use of gendered language. So she comes up with two terms that are just incredible. Male to constructed female and female to constructed male transsexuals.
Oh my god. Okay, this is just Tim's. Yeah, there's a term TERFs love to use, which is trans-identified male, which obviously they intend it as a derogatory slur for male to female transsexuals or whatever term you prefer. And yeah, it's just that, but in slightly more sociological language.
Yeah, so she has a couple of these other terms. So we have transsexualism, we've already seen, as opposed to like transsexuality. And, you know, she explicitly talks about, she picks the ism because she thinks it's an ideology. You know, this is not a natural phenomenon, this is a social phenomenon. There's this ideology that these psychologists and these surgeons are producing. We'll see later, towards the end of this episode, we'll see my favorite term she comes up with, which is the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist. So she's got a whole bunch of them. She's not going to retreat on language. There's a beautiful part in the introduction where she explains she's going to use the pronoun he everywhere, not out of this like pseudo-universal he as the generic human, but because she wants to call these people men.
It's actually even funnier. It's because she wants to call these people men, but it's also she's saying because the vision of femininity and what femininity is, and like in her feminist analysis, like femininity is a patriarchal construct. And so she's saying, I'm using he because all of this is constructed by and for men. And the thing is, that's actually the pseudo, like she's saying, I don't want to use it in the pseudo-universal way, but that actually is the pseudo-universal way. Like when people use he as a universal, like that's what they're saying. And so
that's the whole feminist objection to using he as a universal.
And so it's really funny to be like, I'm not doing this in the misogynist way, right? And then the other thing to say is that her terminology here, male to constructed female, her point is like, okay, these people are clearly no longer fully male, like there is something gender happening, but it's not feminine, and so she doesn't even want to say male to female. She specifically objects to like any kind of calling people female because it's constructed, right? So she kind of is actually describing transsexuals as like people of gender, right? Like people where suddenly the gender is socially constructed as opposed to people who are their natural gender. Another term that's often used at this time is genetic, and this isn't even in trans communities also later, like people were using this terminology, like instead of saying cis, people would say like genetic males or females. So this is another term we'll see.
I'm a little puzzled about the descriptions of the integrity of the body and the integrity of the total person and the integrity of the society and what exactly the relationship between those is supposed to be.
Right. So the solution she has for all of this, she titles the name under the name of an ethic of integrity. And so she's going to get into what integrity is. But in order to understand what integrity is, we have to understand what causes transsexuality. So the first chapter of this book is just like, it's called Everything You Wanted to Know About Transsexualism, and it's just completely wrong. Like, there's some basic facts that are correct, and then there's just like a bunch of quick history and then her own obsessions, and it's not that illuminating. So we didn't pull much from there.
Chapter 2 is then a critique of the sexologists and this biological explanation. Basically, it's a chapter-long explanation of why John Money sucks. Now, John Money does suck. You could make a whole Odium episode about John Money and the various ways in which he's terrible, so...
Maybe you could give the listeners a quick indication of who John Money is.
John Money was a sexologist, a psychologist, and he tried to, give this theory of gender identity, where he said that, gender identity was kind of imprinted, I think it was within the first 18 months. And, like a lot of these people, he didn't do a good job of, respecting the agency of his patients. And the most notable case is one where there was, one of his patients, he did try to, there was, a surgical mishap or something, and they tried to take this young boy and try to raise him as a girl, and didn't work. He ended up killing himself, I believe. Just real nasty shit, frankly.
Yeah, basically, it was a botched circumcision, and they were like, okay, let's just raise him as a girl. And it really didn't go well. And for some reason, this is never used until more recently as because your gender isn't your genitals, right? There's actually a lot more going on, and you can't just decide to raise a kid as a different gender. That's not going to work out.
Yeah, your gender actually radiates from your fingernails. It's a question of what color and if you paint them.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, this guy sucks.
Yeah, point is that there's not really much to kind of say here. It's not really her argument. It's just her saying this is what someone else has said about the cause of transsexualism, and here's why I think it's bad, which it is bad. So it's a bit more interesting in the next chapter, because then in chapter 3 she starts moving to kind of talking about the sociological side of things, right? She thinks this is a social phenomenon. This is where she really picks up with her argument then. So chapter 3, titled Mother's Feminized Phallus or Father's Castrated Femme.
Okay, great. I love it. The title of this chapter is meant to suggest the distance between the alleged dominant mothers blamed in the psychological literature for causing transsexualism and the truly dominating medical/psychiatric fathers who create artificial women, parentheses, femmes, end quote. The distance is great. Blaming the mother in the psychological literature, which presupposes that transsexualism is the result of too much mother and too little father, obscures the real cause of transsexualism, patriarchy, and the legions of therapeutic fathers who create transsexuals according to their man-made designs and specifications. Okay, I see. We're only a few steps away already from the future in which transgenderism is a conspiracy perpetrated by pharma companies.
That's already where she's at. And in fact, that's one strand that we didn't bring in from the earlier parts. But I mean, the book is called The Transsexual Empire, and she does talk about why she calls it an empire. And her main critique is that it is this construction of, it's not just the pharma companies, but also sociologists and psychologists and doctors and the medical establishment all conspiring together to form an empire that is creating transsexuals. So that is not just latent in the text, that is pretty explicitly what she's saying.
Gotcha. So if the listeners are not aware, the modern trans-exclusive radical feminist movement it's gotten a lot more overtly fascist over time. I think we can already see that there's a fascist element to it right at the start here. But a lot of them are full-on Nazis, that sort of thing. The ones that sincerely and full-throatedly consider themselves feminists and are pro-abortion, that sort of thing, they're pretty marginal at this point. And as it happens, this concept of a shadowy cabal of the wealthy influencing society so as to cause it to degenerate into transsexualism happens to align very well with all kinds of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And so one of the things we're seeing here is something that is going to grow into a mighty tree of blaming various Jewish people for causing transgenderism.
And there's more broadly some pretty bad political analysis. I mean, it's probably worth saying out loud, like, using the word empire here and trying to tie this into like a critique of empire is pretty bad. I mean, and this was also both socially and even academically sort of starting to become a hot topic that people were talking about, you know, critique of empire and understanding colonialism as something that's bad. And she's in a way trying to kind of push her work into that sphere, right? She's not explicitly saying like, oh, this is a critique of empire and this is sort of an anti-colonial thing, but she is trying to say, you know, this is an empire and this, you know, it's imperial, and she's trying to like bring this out. And throughout the book, there's all sorts of different places where she'll make kind of analyses that use metaphors of race or all these other things that are just quite bad.
Look, women are being colonized by men. That's what's happening. That's my feminist analysis.
That is her analysis, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's one thing to point out here, which is she's kind of nodded to the idea that there's also women who become men. There's not just men who become women. But for some reason, and there's not really she doesn't have a good citation for this claim, but she claims it many times and claims that it's obvious in the literature. Most trans people are male to female.
So this does match with the psychological literature of the day. So this one I don't think we can blame Janice Raymond for. You know, she's getting a lot of these information from these sexologists, you know, who's seen at these sex clinics, who's allowed to transition. And largely it's male to constructed female transsexuals. There are much fewer female to male constructed transsexual, trans men, as a normal person would say. There's much fewer trans men coming through these clinics at this time. There's not zero. You know, there's some famous people like Eric Erickson, who's like actually provided a lot of the funding for some of these clinics. But it is a big number difference at the time. You look now, you know, 50 years later, that's no longer the case. So this is something we'll see kind of with a lot of her analysis, is she takes what she's getting from these like psychologists and sociologists and, you know, she runs with it, and it just ends up not actually being accurate past the 70s, like as the decades go on.
And I also think there's reasons to point out that there's reasons why that's happening in the sociological literature that aren't just having to do with actually the population and what's going on. And if she's going to make this critique of the transsexual empire, but then use all of their data and not try to interrogate, maybe the data collection is bad, or maybe the framework they're using is bad, maybe the data is wrong, it's a little lame.
I mean, she's in part getting her information from people who are in this business to fuck their patients. I think that's pretty notable.
Yeah.
Okay. There are many reasons male to constructed female transsexualism is more predominant. Most obviously, the surgery is easier, less costly, and more developed and publicized. Second, but perhaps less obvious, is the fact that men have been much freer to experiment than women. Thus, even in the area of transsexual treatment and surgery, it seems that men who desire to become female and to live out the gender role that is culturally prescribed for women are actually, in their assertiveness of seeking out and enduring the surgery, conforming much more to the masculine stereotype. Women, through a cultural conditioning that has generated less impulse to experiment, are likely to be much more reticent. I mean, I think there is kind of a barrier here that's preventing trans men from seeking treatment, and I think the primary one is just like class. Like, these are people who are socialized as women, and they have less power and less money, and so it's more difficult for them to do something that's like risky like this, to put themselves in the hands of someone who is likely to be an exploitative creep. Like, yeah. But her ascribing that to just sort of like these gender essentialists, well, she says it's not gender essentialist. She says it's about cultural conditioning. I don't really believe her on that. But she ascribes this to what I think are really like gender essentialist ideas of men as like brave pioneers. And that's bullshit. Third, male transsexualism may well be a graphic expression of the destruction that sex role molding has wrought on men. Thus, it could be perceived as one of the few outlets for men in a rigidly gender-defined society to opt out of their culturally prescribed roles. Women, on the other hand, since the recent rise of feminism, have been able to confront sex role oppression on a socio-political as well as personal level. Thus, women have realized that both masculine and feminine identities and roles are traps.
Not what we're called. Anyway, I think...
But we're seeing here now she's kind of like drawing a contrast between this ideology of transsexualism versus feminism, as these are like contrary, opposite sort of ways of understanding and living in the world. Now, to kind of address an earlier thing that was said, she's getting a lot of this data from these sexologists, these clinics themselves, but it's not entirely fair. She does do some actual like ethnographic work, so she does go out and talk to some male to constructed female transsexuals.
Women are just too cool and woke to be trans. How transsexuals think and speak of themselves is very revealing. In preparation for this writing, I personally interviewed a sampling of 15 transsexuals. In the interviews, 13 of which were with pre- and post-operative male-to-constructed female transsexuals, I consistently asked why they wanted to be women. How, in other words, did they define themselves as female? Most of the transsexuals responded in terms of the classic feminine stereotype. Some wanted to be women because all their lives they had, quote, felt, end quote, they were women trapped in men's bodies. One expressed this, quote, feeling, end quote, in terms of absolute knowledge as opposed to mere desire. More specifically, many transsexuals said they viewed themselves as passive, nurturing, emotional, intuitive, and the like. Very often, many expressed a preference for female dress and makeup. Others saw their feminine identification in terms of feminine occupations, housework, secretarial, and stewardess work. Some expressed feminine identification in terms of marriage and motherhood, wanting to meet the right man, have him take care of me, adopt kids, and bring them up. One expressed very definite views on child rearing that were quite ironic in this context. I would definitely teach my kids that boys should be boys and girls should be girls.
One thing that's immediately worth highlighting is this is not a completely accurate portrayal of what her interviewee said. And we'll see later, she'll like have interviewees say things that are not just, I want this very stereotypical femininity. This is presenting a bit of a skewed look onto what she got out of her interviews.
The other thing to point out is, like, you read this description and there's obvious reasons why trans people being interviewed by an academic would portray their gender this way. And in fact, one of the big responses to this book, The Transsexual Empire, is one of the sort of founding texts in sort of trans studies is Sandy Stone's Empire Strikes Back, and we'll talk more about that later. But one of the main points she makes is like, look, trans people are having access to transition gatekept by the medical establishment, who are expecting them to say this list of things, and so they've said that list of things. It's obvious why this is the case. But she's just like, oh, look at how regressive their gender politics are. And what's even funnier is that when she describes her process of going into these interviews, she even talks about how she gives like a list of the questions and sort of the open-ended interview process, and she discusses a little bit what her methodology is. And she even says like, oh, and when I felt comfortable saying so, like I even voiced some like opposition to this idea of transsexuality or, whatever. And so she's even bringing her own sense of like, oh, I couldn't speak my mind into these interviews. And it's very funny to see
No
that.
reflection, zero reflection.
Yeah.
I wonder if she would go and interview 13 cis women and hear them say that they feel they have absolute knowledge that they're women, and that sometimes they feel nurturing, emotional, intuitive, and the like, and be like, not real women. I can sense it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that this whole framework is set up exactly to produce this dilemma, right? As soon as you're saying these are male to constructed female, and then these are natural women, And then I'm going to really focus on, right, she's not necessarily wrong that, right, her point is I'm going to call the male deconstructed female because female as a sort of gender identity is socially constructed. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily wrong. It's just when you only see that happening in these cases and you don't even look at what you're calling natural women, yeah, you're going to see this weird dichotomy, but it's like you're looking for it. You've constructed your entire like apparatus to see that distinction.
Yeah, like these are things for people to say that are an outcome of patriarchal culture. They are stereotypical. That's absolutely true. But she's not actually looking for the role patriarchy plays in producing people saying these. She's looking for people saying these because she feels that it will validate her understanding of transsexuality as a whole as artificial. Things can have artificial aspects, can express artificial aspects without just like being artificial things.
Yeah, so we're seeing her methodology, we're seeing all of this, and she's talked about all these guys that she doesn't like, and then she gets to this guy, Thomas Kando. So Julia, do you want to talk a little bit about who Thomas Kando is?
Yeah, so, she's not relying entirely on her own interviews. She's not relying entirely on what these sexologists are saying. One of the sources she draws from is this work by this young sociologist, Thomas Kando. And, okay, so like Janice Raymond, this was his dissertation topic. He was at University of Minnesota in the 1960s when the medical school there started doing these surgeries, had a clinic, and he's like, this is a great thing I can do. Like, this is an exciting new topic. I can make a name for myself as an academic. And he wrote some papers. And just to kind of give a view of the sort of guy he is, just do a little bit of ad hominem. While researching this guy, I found on his academic website this document called I Spent My Life Practicing Politically Incorrect Sociology. And let me read some of these. They're basically blog posts from like the 90s and not, so before blogging was
Before
a
you
thing.
read those, Sarah, just notice the page count on this document. I've like screenshotted this in just the way.
We are on page 1 out of 529. Holy shit.
He took all his blog posts and he compiled them into a PDF. So, here's some of these 90s and nots blog posts. I'll just give you the titles.
Oh my god.
Aren't blacks as guilty of racism as whites? On that note, aren't women as guilty of sexism as men? The 1956 Hungarian Revolution was a Stalinist plot. Kando was Hungarian, so that's the interest. Sociologists are too preoccupied with homosexuality. Me too. And this last one, are prime numbers fun?
Wait, are prime numbers fun?
Well, Betteridge's law of headlines applies.
I see.
Yeah, they're not fun. He's got a whole section in there on mathematical opinions. And then there's also some fun stuff in there. There's like some of this he wrote, you can see that this was written in 2007, or this was compiled in 2007.
This is such a classic crank. I can't believe he even goes into math crankery. This is so funny.
There is some stuff on there about like the lead up to the Iraq War where he has a whole section on, he's like, I'm going to take on the right now, right? Like, I'm politically incorrect, but I'm a brave maverick. I'm not just hating on the left. I'm going to hate on the right a little bit. And so he has got a whole blog post about how, like, Fox News is too anti-French. That, like, the anti-French sentiment on Fox News and, like, in the early Iraq War and the whole, like, Freedom Fries thing is, like, anti-French bigotry, that they're doing anti-French racism. So he's got a whole thing defending the French, which as a Francophobe podcast, I gotta flag that.
Black people, oh, thumbs down. The French, oh yeah.
I mean, that's a very French opinion to have.
But it's also funny because that's his leftism, right? That's his, like, I'm gonna go against the right too by saying I'm a fan of the French. Don't hate on the French. It's just very funny.
Thomas Kando, welcome to the resistance.
Yeah, so Julia sent this to me, and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. Okay, we can't talk too much about this guy. It needs to be an Odium episode. And then I started reading these, and I was like, I'm never reading this document. I'm not making an Odium episode on this guy. No. But yeah, it's pretty incredible. Just skimming through it is really fun. I'll send you the link later, and you can, like, peruse it. But it's...
Oh, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she uses a lot from Thomas Kando, and this is one of her big sources in this chapter 3. So his study was called Sex Change, the Achievement of Gender Identity Among Feminized Transsexuals. Drop the screenshot.
In contrast to the psychological and biological theorists, Kando spotlights the social problem immediately. Quote, unlike the feminists who argue that the social structure is unjust with respect to women and therefore needs reform, transsexuals decide to alter their own physical sex in order to legitimately conform to cultural expectations, end quote. He affirms that transsexuals aim primarily to achieve the desired sex roles and not merely the anatomy of the opposite sex. In answer to the question of what is the ultimate criterion of being a woman, transsexuals emphasize mostly social psychological criteria. 10 out of 17 mention such things as being attracted to men, being loved and needed by the family, and behaving like a woman. It is significant here that most of the transsexuals questioned did not see biological criteria, that is, the female organs themselves, as ultimate reasons for changing sex.
Right, so Kando's kind of big thesis is that male deconstructed female transsexuals are very conforming to stereotypical femininity, more so than biological women.
This is a very current TERF argument. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's something that you notice when reading this book is everything you see, like kind of the anti-trans from like a quote-unquote progressive or feminist side, nothing is new. It's all just like repeating these ideas from decades ago. But this next excerpt is one that we picked just to make Sarah make funny faces. This is also, again, talking about Kando's work.
Most of the transsexuals perceive their sexual relationships, even preoperatively, as heterosexual. One transsexual, Sally, phrased this in rather direct language. I hate homos. I never wanted sex with them. I had homosexual affairs in grade school and in high school, but only with normals. As Kando summarizes, transsexuals are reactionary, moving back toward the core culture rather than away from it. They are the Uncle Toms of the sexual revolution. With these individuals, the dialectic of social change comes full circle, and the position of greatest deviance becomes that of greatest conformity. Okay, first off, Sally, absolutely ridiculous phrasing. It makes total sense to me that someone who is a woman would want to sleep with people who are attracted to them as a woman. You know, like,
yeah,
it's dispiriting to imagine someone being attracted to me personally because they like male typical characteristics. I don't want that. Second, don't say Uncle Tom that way, man. Like, you're gonna be publishing your blog posts in like a 500-page PDF later about like how the blacks are going too far. Dude, you can't say that. Come on, please. Third, the dialectic of social change comes full circle, and the position of greatest deviance becomes that of greatest conformity. I don't believe you know what those words mean, dude. Like, you're just trying to say it looks like it is, but actually it isn't. It's the opposite of that. I'm using the word dialectic, so this is probably intellectually coherent.
Yeah, don't you know that a dialectic is when there's two things, but you need 3 points to determine a circle? It doesn't make any sense, Thomas Kando.
We would call this horseshoe theory today.
That's right, we're doing horseshoe theory.
Yeah, so basically, you know, she quotes from her interviews, she quotes from this Tom Kando guy that transsexuals are very, very conforming. Now, the problem with saying this is that it's not true. Like, there's lots of counterexamples, and in fact, some of these counterexamples she's discussed. So one of them we already touched on, which was Jan Morris. Jan Morris was a British journalist. She's probably most well known for being the journalist who accompanied the first recorded, like, summiting of Mount Everest. So she was the one who didn't go all the way to the top. I think it was like 20,000 feet above sea level, and reported that. And she wrote a transition memoir, Conundrum, where she kind of talked about her experiences. And what becomes clear if one reads this is that, you know, Jan Morris is not just solely this, every time from the very beginning I've wanted to be the most stereotypical housewife, woman, whatever.
So we have to see, you know, Janice Raymond has to contend with this, and so this is what she has to say on the matter.
Another way of viewing Morris's acceptance and seemingly contradictory extolling of both stereotypes is to say that Morris squeezed out of his male status all the vigor of young manhood. However, at the age of 47, in the decline of his male vigor, he latched on to the status of a woman. Since women are often more vigorous when they are older and the cultural pressures have subsided, Morris captures the best of both worlds, so to speak. Transsexualism thus allows him to fully exploit both stereotypes. I laughed because there's a famous tweet about referring to a trans woman as best of both worlds. Furthermore, what Morris and other transsexuals exhibit in their acceptance of both identity and role artifacts is not unique to transsexual males. This psychology of acceptance has been noted in other male contexts. For example, Susan Brown Miller, in her groundbreaking work Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, cites rape in male prisons as a means of transforming tough and masculine men into what are called gal boys. Brown Miller, in her section on male rape in prison, gives us one more example of how the change from one role to another is managed in an astonishingly brief time.
Right, so there's basically, every possible outcome is already determined, right? These are male deconstructed female transsexuals. If they're going all the way into these stereotypes, it's just proof that they're fully into this. If they don't fully go into the stereotypes, it's because, masculinity and femininity were all like the same thing all along. So, one has to wonder if there's any possible way she could have imagined these people behaving that wouldn't have confirmed her thesis.
Yeah, it's a totally rigged game. And furthermore, even though she claims to be supportive of people breaking sex stereotypes, the portrayal here is of trans women who are not stereotypically feminine as being exploitative in doing so. They're wringing the vigor out of their young maleness.
It's also so funny to be like, oh, obviously she transitioned later in life, because you know how culture really
loves older women,
venerates older women and gives power to older women, and older women are so respected and have such a voice, and it's like, what are you talking about?
Dude, the dominant cultural theme in thinking about aging women is this concept of going over the hill or hitting the wall, which is just like when women are deemed to have had their value dropped to essentially zero when they hit a certain age.
That's weird, because all I see when people talk about aging women is the word MILF a lot. So I don't know where you two are, but that's not my cultural milieu.
Yeah, I think that's a consequence of the sites you're on, Julia.
Right, so we have a second screenshot here. This is another example of the contradictions of the male deconstructed female transsexual.
Another recent example of the apparent contradictions that Jan Morris represents is described in an article that appeared in the Gay Community News, reporting on 3 male deconstructed female transsexuals: Carolyn, Heather, and Sandy. Most of the questions that were asked in this interview seem devised to judge the degree of stereotypical identification of the 3 with dominant feminine norms. The contradiction in Carolyn's statements about sex role stereotyping is fairly obvious. Carolyn identified, quote, herself, end quote, as a feminist. When asked what attributes, all the female pronouns are in quotes here, when asked what attributes she would describe to a woman, she refused to comment on the grounds that it was sexist to limit certain characteristics to a certain sex. However, when pushed further on what is essential to being a woman, she responded with a classic stereotyped answer: being willing to be sincere and loving and being able to just give a great deal, get it back too, care for somebody, put together a nice home. A second transsexual, Sandy, rejected macho men but then admitted that she desired to be dominated by men in bed. The third, Heather, also considered herself a feminist, disliked macho men, considered herself aggressive and independent, but on the other hand was reduced to selling her body to men. My own interview data confirms the same kind of contradictions. R, for example, said she didn't believe in part of the stereotypically feminine role, such as doing housework, wanting kids, staying around the house, but she delighted in wearing profuse makeup and frilly feminine clothes. R also made the very important point that one of the reasons transsexuals may seem to conform exaggeratedly to the stereotype is that they have to prove to the gender identity clinics that they can pass, i.e. live, work, dress, and be accepted as women. This, of course, raises the significant issue of to what extent the medical and psychiatric professions contribute, perpetuate, and reinforce the stereotyping syndrome.
Several things to pull out of this quote, but I want to focus on this last one first. What does this interviewee R say? They have to prove to the clinics that they can pass as women, and that's why they seem to fill these stereotypes. This is a huge crack in Raymond's thesis now, that, you know, there's this agency of these transsexual women, that maybe what she's seeing is not actually accurate, and she should be a bit more skeptical as to some of these sources. But this crack will keep reappearing. But
yeah, she's correctly picking out a lack of authenticity. She just doesn't understand that it's like so corrosive to her argument.
Well, her response to it is like, this is a lack of authenticity, therefore...
Yeah, she's like, this is the kind of authenticity that supports what I'm saying, when it's exactly the opposite.
Right. She's reading it as like, oh, these people are being disingenuous because they need to be disingenuous to the gender identity clinic.
Which is true, but...
and therefore they must be disingenuous more broadly for no reason. Like, and it doesn't even enter into her mind the obvious point that there are spheres where you might have to be inauthentic to get these things, but that doesn't mean that you are fully inauthentic, right? Like, it's the thing you said, right? You can have aspects of this inauthentic or this artificiality, but that doesn't make everything artificial. It's just, yeah, it's so obvious, and it's this huge crack, and she just doesn't see it at all. Related to that, in the same paragraph, she's talking about, you know, the same kinds of contradictions. And what is the contradiction here? That she likes some feminine things and not others. She has her own, you know, she's not interested in playing the stereotypical feminine role in some ways, but she likes makeup. That's not a contradiction. That's just called like being a person and having opinions about your life. And it's not a contradiction to not want kids but like wearing makeup. That's not a contradiction, Janice. Like, what are you talking about?
Well, what we're kind of seeing here is, you know, what's going to sort of wreck the feminist movement like the 80s with these like lesbian sex wars, like with this political lesbianism. What are the appropriate ways to be a lesbian, to be a sexual person? And like, yeah, being overly femme, like that was frowned upon, these like butch femme dynamics. Or this thing about like, you know, Sandy rejects macho men but wants to be dominated in bed. Again, like, you know, can lesbians do S&M? This was a point of contention where there were arguments on both sides, and it kind of tore apart the feminist movement. Or my favorite here, Heather, you know, considers herself a feminist independent, but also has to do sex work to survive, and that's a contradiction. What the
None
fuck?
of those are contradictions. Those are all just situations that people are in.
I mean, I'm really noticing that for a feminist, she seems to have no interest in how gendered power dynamics can play out. Like, when we're talking about Carolyn, the first person who's talked about here, initially she refuses to respond to being prodded to be sexist, and then they pressure her, and she's like, she gives some like vague statement that touches on the kind of themes they want, and instead of viewing this as someone who is being like squeezed by these interviewers to express like a gender role, she's just like, oh, well, that's an essential characteristic of who Carolyn is. Like, we get to see her true views, just totally ignoring the role of like the social power of the interviewer in this situation. And then the person who's, quote, reduced to selling her body to men, like, first off, okay, so she's a sex worker exclusionary radical feminist.
Yes.
But like, she takes that role as a prostitute to be something that is essential to this person and revealing of who this person is, when it's just the job that she has. It doesn't tell you about how authentically feminine she is or not. That's an incredibly patriarchal thing to say.
Yeah, and it's more of this game being rigged. Either you are stereotypically feminine and then you're upholding stereotypes, or you are not stereotypically feminine and then that's a contradiction for some reason. It's all just purely misogynist. And I think this is one of the things we want to just bring up and talk about with this is there's a perception by a lot of people that like turfiness grows out of a certain kind of like man-hating feminist, right? That like what happened is the radical feminists hated men, and they hated men so much, and they see trans women as men, and that's why they hate trans women. And you dive into this and it's so obvious that like, no, this is misogynist. This isn't like just transphobic. This is just straight up misogynist. This is talking about women in this really misogynist way. And So I think we want to keep that in mind when we get to the next chapter. Or no, we're going to actually skip over the next chapter for now, and we'll come back to it because she writes them out of order, and it's really awkward ordering. But she gets to chapter 5, Therapy is a Way of Life. And in here is where she provides her solution. So she's described this problem. In her mind, she's described a coherent picture of the ideology of transsexualism. There's obviously huge gaps and it's sort of incoherent, but she's gone through the problem. So now she's going to tell us what her solution is. And here's where we're going to have to decide, how much of this is theology? How much is she influenced here by the feminist theology of her advisor? So this part is called Therapy is a Way of Life is the name of this chapter.
The medical model itself promotes this so-called normalization, and in doing so limits the quest for self-transcendence. The kinds of health values it generates do not encourage the transsexual to recognize that such health may be unhealthy in the long run. Health values are all of a piece again with our philosophy of adjustment, spurious individualism, and unashamed and thoughtless self-seeking. Such notions of health make true individualism and autonomy unachievable, rendering the individual passive, acquiescent, and medically manipulatable. They deprive the individual of the possibility of transcendent activity and center him/her on false goods, parentheses, gods.
Yeah, so something that's becoming apparent here is this is another one of Raymond's bugbears, is she's very skeptical of contemporary medicine and medical practice and the science of it, and, skeptical as to what is the meaning of health. So she's very anti-psychiatry, for example. Something else she spent a lot of her career on is she's various, reproductive technology, surrogacy, embryo selection, things like that. She's very much against all of these things. And so this is kind of coming into this is, she thinks that, this is just, the wrong view of, what health is, and there has to be, this other approach to it.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I grew up in, a hippy-dippy California community, and it was full of sort of, I guess you could say, proto-wellness fascists who all got, really into QAnon later. And this reads exactly like those people.
Yeah, when I was reading this, I was like, oh, this sounds like all the MAHA, Make America Healthy Again stuff you see recently with RFK Jr.
Yeah,
we got to end
exactly.
vaccinations, mothers shouldn't have Tylenol while they're pregnant, these sorts of things. So what is her solution then? Coming from feminism, I think feminists love is consciousness raising. And so she proposes sort of consciousness raising as a social therapy to be the solution.
Consider the possibility of counseling that encouraged the transsexual to break both stereotypes. Here, the transsexual would be encouraged to become the agent of her or his own energies and to strive for more varied modes of being and becoming. In a very real sense, at this point, the transsexual would become a social critic. All of us are in some way constricted by sex role socialization. One way of viewing transsexuals is that they are uniquely constricted by the rigidified definitions of masculinity and femininity. The general cultural constrictions from which we all suffer become body-laden with them. However, deprived of an alternative framework in which to view the problem, the transsexual is unable to express the problem clearly. The gender identity clinics have a vested interest in suppressing criticism and may collude with the transsexual to solve the problem in an ultimately uncritical way. Given a different mode of therapy where consciousness raising is the primary modus operandi, the transsexual might not find it as necessary to resort to sex conversion surgery. Yeah, okay. She just really, really does not want trans people to have medical treatment. That's the first thing. She also really doesn't want them to socially transition, but I get the sense that's a secondary priority.
Yeah, in some sense. And it's such a contradiction to be talking about foregrounding autonomy and individualism at the same time to say we need to have this counseling, this consciousness-raising counseling that helps you achieve that autonomy and individualism, which also, by the way, is going to make it so that you don't need all these other things. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, she's just talking about, conversion therapy with kind of a woke kind of, oh, we're not converting you back to, we're not trying to teach trans women, we're not trying to put them in conversion therapy to make them men. We're trying to put them in conversion therapy to make them woke, and then they'll be men, but they'll be woke men. But it's it's the same shit, right?
Notice the sleight of hand where she's pretending that she wants to encourage the transsexual to break both stereotypes, when in fact what she's done in all the excerpts we've seen is she's taken every behavior that someone transgender has exhibited and categorized it as either male stereotype or female stereotype. Actually, according to her, everything you do fits into that binary. It's one or the other.
I mean, remember Sartre in Anti-Semite and Jew talking about how bigotry exactly works this way. There's nothing that the Jew can do that the anti-Semite cannot turn into a product of of his Jewishness, right? Like, either the Jew is stingy and then that's the stingy Jew, or the Jew is generous and then that's the Jew trying to pretend not to be the stingy Jew by being generous. And it's like, it's the same thing.
Well, and I think one thing to highlight here is kind of as we were talking about earlier is, she's relying really heavily on contemporary accounts, and if you step forward decades into the future, these things start to no longer be true. So, not everywhere, but in the US at least, this therapy gatekeeping model is mostly dead. It still exists for minors, but for adults, they've moved away from this model. You no longer have a therapist, standing in the way if you want hormones. And what we've seen is this has not ended, quote-unquote, sex conversion therapy, right? It's not these therapists that are creating the problem, that are creating these people with these desires. When this is gone, these people still have these desires.
Even today, places where there is more gatekeeping, places where, right, like states in the US where they have gone fully towards more self-ID and informed consent models, you see more transition, right? Like, it's not, like, the places that do more gatekeeping, that restrict things more for minors, and even that require more, I mean, there are still, for procedures and things, you still need to get letters from therapists, but therapists are, it's a different interaction now than it was back then. But sort of the easier these things become and the less gatekeeping, the less of the medical establishment intervenes, like, we see the number of trans people increasing because people are able to access the care that they want. And so it's pretty obviously not the medical establishment implanting this desire in people just on the numbers. You can just look and see that if you'd opened your eyes at this point.
I think if you opened your eyes in the 70s, you would see this, and I think our next excerpt kind of demonstrates this. This next excerpt isn't from Raymond herself. This is from Sandy Stone. Sandy Stone does make an appearance later in the transsexual empire, but she wrote a response paper in the 90s, The Empire Strikes Back. And yeah, so she kind of talks about the same phenomenon of where is this desire coming from? Is it coming from these people, or is it coming from the medical establishment?
The scenario worked this way. Initially, the only textbook on the subject of transsexualism was Harry Benjamin's definitive work, The Transsexual Phenomenon. When first clinics were constituted, Benjamin's book was the researcher's standard reference. And when the first transsexuals were evaluated for their suitability for surgery, their behavior matched up gratifyingly with Benjamin's criteria. The researchers produced papers which reported on this, and which were used as bases for funding. It took a surprisingly long time, several years, for the researchers to realize that the reason the candidates' behavioral profiles matched Benjamin's so well was that the candidates too had read Benjamin's book, which was passed from hand to hand within the transsexual community, and they were only too happy to provide the behavior that led to acceptance for surgery.
So Sandy Stone here is speaking, out of research, but also out of personal experience. She was one of these male deconstructed female transsexuals who did not really fit the diagnostic criteria. Maybe most significantly, one of these criteria was being attracted only to men, wanting to basically be a housewife. Sandy Stone was a lesbian. So this, Janice Raymond missed the direction of causality here. What is causing this transsexual phenomenon is transsexuals, people who want these changes to their body, want these hormones, want these surgeries, and these clinics, whether it was in Hirschfeld's day, or these gender clinics in the 70s, or today in the 21st century, are all just responding to people with this desire.
And one of the things she also says sort of around this point is, part of, it's not just even her personal experience, but it was sort of more common. And now, now things are on the internet, and so sociologically it's a little bit different. But she said, look, trans people all have like their own personal little archive of like trans stories and things that they've heard from people and things that have been passed down. And so she's like, so I've talked to my friends and like we have our own data and our own experiences and our own like autobiographical stories that are outside of this like sexological research model. And it's obvious that this is happening, right? And so they're like, she is pointing out both this feedback loop and also this failure of sociology if you're going to take only the data that exists in this model as your basis for doing analysis, right? So it's pretty easy stuff to just point out and say, yeah, this is a huge crack in Janice Raymond's argument, but here's Janice Raymond's rebuttal to this kind of claim.
Transsexual surgery, in much the same way, produces satisfaction and relief for the transsexual. In contrast to more overt, coercive forms of behavior control and modification, such as involuntary commitment in prisons or mental institutions, or informed consent obtained while in these same institutions, transsexualism appears to be blissfully and freely chosen. Yet, just as commentators have asked how a truly informed consent can be obtained in a coercive context, such as a prison or mental institution, I would pose the question, how can transsexuals truly give informed consent and freely choose to convert to the opposite sex anatomy and role when the coercive power of sex role socialization is filtered through all institutions in a patriarchal society? Not that such socialization is deterministic, but rather that it deeply conditions one's choices as well as one's motivation to choose. In a traditional sense, no one forced the transsexual to change sex. No one forced the transsexual to start hormone therapy. No one forced the transsexual into opposite sex roles and behavior. But in a society where masculinity and femininity accompany a male or female body, the options are limited, if one does not have a context of support to transcend these roles. When the transsexual experts maintain that they use transsexual procedures only with people who ask for them, and who prove that they can pass, they obscure the social reality. Given patriarchy's prescription that one must be either masculine or feminine, free choice is conditioned. She says the socialization is not deterministic, but that it rather deeply conditions one's choices as well as one's motivation to choose. What is the distinction there? Exactly. Like, what she is really saying that, like, it may look like these people are being proactive, like they are freely choosing to undergo trans medical procedures, but trust me, they're being fucked with. Their heads are being absolutely puppeted.
So she actually has an analogy here that I think will elucidate this point, which I didn't clip in because it's really bad. But she explicitly compares this to the use of drugs in the Black community in the U.S. and how it might look like people are choosing to do drugs, but really it's really bad. So basically her response to your question is like, interesting question. Would you like to also know I am a racist?
Great stuff.
But yeah, like,
you could critique this argument by pointing out that it proves something too strong, because of course, like, trans people aren't the only ones who live in a patriarchal society and aren't the only ones whose, like, behaviors and stuff are influenced by this. And I mean, maybe she'll bite that bullet. Maybe she'll agree with Andrea Dworkin and she'll say, like, all sex is rape because we live in a society that doesn't allow one, like, true informed consent. But I think a lot of people would not take that step and not go that far. This argument is proving way too much. It's got to have a problem.
I actually think it's like a completely meaningful question. Like, do people really choose to be women or men, that sort of thing? It's the fact that she's only choosing to apply it to trans people that is really revealing.
Yeah, and I mean, that is what a lot of different people who talk about the social construction of gender and gendered performance and performativity, and like this is what it's trying to analyze, is the way that, and like this is something that we've talked about in different contexts before, but the way that it, like, these patriarchal, like these stereotypes she calls them in the, like, patriarchal society, it's not just something which restricts your choices, it's actually something that enables the possibility of choice and performance and interaction in society. Like it happens at a deeper level than just certain prohibitions on certain actions. And this is what a lot of, like, 20th century, like, Foucault and all these people are talking about all the time. It doesn't answer any of those questions to just say, like, oh, well, you just got to do what your natural body is, right? That just completely throws out the whole critique you've been building to. And we've just seen this again and again.
Yeah, so she has more issues with this kind of informed consent for transition. So this is about 10 pages later.
A third issue to consider is just how informed consent can be attained, especially in the face of so many unknown hazards about the experiment. First of all, a truly informed consent would highlight, for the transsexual, the whole issue of sex roles and gender definitions themselves. It would reveal to him how moving from one stereotype to its opposite does not even minimally alter the social basis of sex role conformity in this culture, and how the transsexual, in undertaking surgery, is reinforcing this conformity. These are what might be called the social hazards of the transsexual experiment. My survey of the literature and first-hand interviews with transsexuals and transsexual clinicians thus far have revealed that these social hazards, or even their possibility, are not explored. Yeah, they're not explored because it's fucking stupid. What are you talking about by growing tits and reinforcing social conformity? What?
It's kind of funny to imagine a psychologist like counseling a patient, you'd like to do this, but have you considered that by doing this, you're reinforcing gender norms? Are you sure you want to do that?
Yeah, it'd be really funny to go to the therapist and then be sent home with, like, Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women and, a reading list to do, right?
Yeah, we need to give the trannies homework.
Instead of the dialectical behavior therapy workbook, you're giving the workbook of, like, how to be a feminist.
I mean, funny you say that, because this is more or less what she thinks should happen. So when she has an appendix, suggestions for change, where she gets a little more practical and she wants to talk about what sort of, like, counseling or peer group support should be useful, and she does base it on these sort of, like, feminist reading groups.
This is exactly the sort of thinking that leads to pregnancy crisis centers getting set up. Like, actually, you don't really understand what you're doing with your body here, and maybe what instead we should have is these fake institutions where you come in and someone hectors you about you're doing this morally wrong thing, and are you sure you want the medical treatment?
Yeah, so, I mean, you say that, and I think it's time for us to sort of the section heading in the outline that Julie and I are using for this episode, just titled Catholicism. Like, she's just being Catholic here. This whole thing is just Catholicism. Right? Like, and we've seen, right? It's exactly that thing. It's just, there's this order for the world, and your body is designed not by God, because she's pretending that it's not Catholicism, but she, it's your body has a natural purpose, and you're doing the wrong thing with it.
And you should feel guilty about it, by the way.
Yeah, so here's her description. Here's her actual description of what this kind of consciousness-raising therapy should look like in this next excerpt.
However, aside from this one-to-one form of counseling, the model of consciousness-raising emphasizes the group process itself. As women have analyzed their own problems as women in consciousness-raising groups, it is extremely important that transsexuals, as persons wishing to change sex, take their particular manifestation of gender oppression into their own hands. Transsexuals are not women. They are deviant males, and their particular manifestation of gender deviancy needs its own unique context of peer support. Peer support has been one of the crucial aspects of consciousness raising in feminist groups. Given the support of other women, it became possible for many to break the bonds of so-called core gender identity. In the same way, peer support could be extremely insightful for transsexuals. It could help surface the deeper issues that lie behind the problem of why one finds oneself with, for example, a female mind in a male body, in quotes. It could then assist in exploring whether indeed this is the proper label for the transsexual's unique form of sex role oppression. Such counseling and group interaction would be far more honest than the present forms of therapy that promote passing. I am not so naive as to think that they will make transsexualism disappear overnight, but they would at least pose the existence of a real alternative to be explored and tried. Given peer encouragement to transcend cultural definitions of both masculinity and femininity without changing one's body, persons considering transsexualism might not find it as necessary to resort to sex conversion surgery.
So the comparison, this connection to Catholicism is interesting because you read this, and at least to me, this reads like these very like Christian conversion therapy groups for like gay teens. Like, you know, you catch your son with another boy, and you send him off to like this like specialist, this pastor, and he gets in a group, and all these like troubled teens together are like trying to explain, like being led to explain to each other why they shouldn't do this same sexual activity, and it's incredibly similar. So,
well, there is one key difference, which is that she's eliding the presence of the authority. It's completely invisible in here. She only talks about the peers. But actually, in this whole scenario of all these trans people sitting around in a room talking about gender, she's there too. And she's guiding them, and she's saying, no. It's not like that. It's like this.
Right, because the thing is, the notion of groups of trans women getting together and talking about feminism... We know
exactly what's going to happen there, which is, first off, they're going to become feminists. Second, they're all going to sleep together.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And this is, like, obviously a thing. Like, you can tell that it's important for her to have the authority figure there, because if it weren't, this would already exist. Like, you don't think trans people are, like, congregating and talking to each other? We do it constantly. We're in a podcast with 3 of us right now.
Yeah, and so it's important that she wants to pretend like this is the same thing as, like, consciousness-raising feminist groups, but she explicitly wants it to be like oriented towards a particular outcome for the person, right? And so it is much more this Catholic conversion therapy rather than any kind of progressive consciousness raising group.
And you can make the connection to kind of like anti-gay, like this conservative Christian anti-gay stuff is, you know, some of them will be like, oh yeah, I want to like legally like make this unallowed. But, you know, the more sophisticated ones that want to seem progressive will be like, no. I don't want to legislate against this. I just kind of want to morally mandate it out of existence. And this is the same language that Raymond uses in her book as, you know, I contend that the problem of transsexualism would be best served by morally mandating it out of existence. You see a lot of these anti-trans, anti-gay parallels there.
Man, you were talking about the TERF stereotype as being like, it grows out of man-hating feminism, and like, the further we go on, the more contrary that the reality is to that. I mean, this is incredible.
So we've seen a little bit about her solution then, right? It's this consciousness raising, this conversion therapy essentially. But we should talk a little bit about the values that are underlying this solution. So again, this is really where the Mary Daly influence is showing through. So she has this whole chapter, chapter 6, where she talks about this, what she calls ethic of integrity.
Right. So this is where we're really going to get into, like, you asked the question at the beginning, what does she mean by integrity? This is where she's going to answer. That's what this whole chapter is about.
The first excerpt is her definition.
Briefly, integration means putting together a combination of parts in order to achieve completeness or wholeness. In contrast, the word integrity means an original wholeness from which no part can be taken away. It is my contention that, in a deep philosophical sense, transsexual therapy and treatment have encouraged integration solutions rather than helping individuals to realize an integrity of being.
This gets really into the philosophical weeds. You could spend a lot of time really digging into this. I think maybe rather than doing that, it would be more helpful to get like a little bit of a taste of the sort of argumentation going on here.
Yeah, I think, you know, something the listener would have heard is that she writes being with like a dash in the middle, and sometimes she even writes like being and then parentheses becoming, and she's trying to kind of use this like 20th century like Heidegger language, and it's not actually using the concepts in like that real or meaningful a way. It's just academic speak.
In this sense, androgyny represents a partial recognition of an integrity that goes beyond male and female bodies. Many writers see Jesus as the unique bearer of androgynous humanity. This conception of Jesus, implicit in some of the Gnostic literature, is developed by Erigena in his portrayal of the resurrected Jesus, and reaches its apex in Jacob Boehme. Other writers see the very nature of God as an androgynous unity, sometimes referred to as the divine androgen, and sometimes portrayed as both male and female in its manifestations. This conception of God is most evident in the Kabbalah and in Jacob Boehme. However, there is very often an undercurrent of male mothering in connection with androgyny. Although the primal Adam is written about as androgynous or hermaphroditic, one is still left with the impression that the original human was more male than female. This undercurrent is conveyed in the language of the Kabbalah. Eve existed in Adam, in potentiality from the first. The language here is most important, for if anything, biologically speaking, it was Adam who was contained in Eve from the beginning. Other statements imply that it was Eve, woman, who was separated from man, giving the impression that the female part of the original androgyne was more fragmented and less perfect than the male, so that even though the primal person was supposedly androgynous, this creature was composed of one distinctly more perfect part and one distinctly less perfect part. Thus, the male portion of androgyny remains steady and constant, while the female is the wayward, unsteady half. In the Gnostics, moreover, the female must make herself male before a salvific androgyny can be reached.
So, very much pulling from this, feminist theology that's coming from Mary Daly, right? It speaks for itself. We could maybe read a little Mary Daly to get more of a taste of what's going on here.
Yeah, so this is her advisor.
The madness which is the Dionysian final solution for women, is confusion, inability to distinguish the female self and her process from the male-made masquerade. Dionysus sometimes assumed a girl-like form. The phenomenon of the drag queen dramatically demonstrates such boundary violation. This is getting bad. Like White's playing blackface, he incorporates the oppressed role without being incorporated in it. In the phenomenon of transsexualism, the incorporation/confusion is deeper. As ethicist Janice Raymond has pointed out, the majority of transsexuals are male to female, while transsexed females basically function as tokens and are used by the rulers of the transsexual empire to hide the real nature of the game. In transsexualism, males put on female bodies, which are in fact pseudo-female. In a real sense, they are separated from their original mothers by the rituals of the counseling process, which usually result in discovering that the mother of the transsexual-to-be is at fault for his gender identity crisis. These patients are reborn from males. As Linda Barufaldi suggested, this fact was symbolized in the renaming of the renowned transsexual of tennis, Renee Richards, whose original first name was Richard. The rebirthing male supermothers include psychiatrists, surgeons, hormone therapists, and other cooperating professionals. The surgeons and hormone therapists of the transsexual kingdom, in their effort to give birth, can be said to produce feminine persons. They cannot produce women. This is awful. Holy shit. God damn.
Trying to reach for an analogy and being like, by the way, my racial politics are also terrible, is just, it's very consistent.
Yeah, I think kind of what I want to highlight here is, don't think we're poo-pooing this for using academic language. I think all of us are the sort of perverts who love this sort of thing, but it's a very controversial foundation to form the basis of your attack on transsexualism. Someone can very well agree that John Money sucks, that there's problems with this medical model, but I'm sorry, this Dionysian final solution, this whole stuff about divine androgyny, very in the weeds.
I would describe this as just paranoid animus.
Interesting you mentioned paranoia, because this will come back.
Yeah, and even this thing, right, the point she's making about, being renamed to Renee Richards because Renee means reborn.
That's really cute.
She wants to read this kind of, paranoid conspiracy in just, she just chose the name Renee. I don't know, that's cute. What are you trying to, I don't know. It's...
Yeah, the ritual of the Dionysian final solution is symbolized in this trans woman choosing her name to be Renee. What are you talking about?
It's another thing we've seen a lot in this podcast where bigots will try to explain a problem and they'll just say something that's totally normal, but then with ominous music in the background, right? Like we saw this a lot with Enoch Powell talking about doing like demographic analysis of like this many people move from this place to this place, and in this year this many, and it's just like, yeah, cool, dude. Who cares, right?
So she talks about trans-sexed females, by which she means trans men, basically function as tokens and are used by the rulers of the transsexual empire to hide the real nature of the game. Okay, so first off, the paranoia sent on that is like a thick musk. Like, it's disgusting. Second, it's actually still unclear to me what the real nature of the game is, despite all the explanation we've seen. Like, it's a little unclear to me, like, what the goal is? What is the aim that is being hidden exactly?
The ultimate aim is to medically and biologically replace women. I'm not joking. Like, this shows up in Raymond's book. She continually comes back to this, like, you know, these physicians who have written about, you know, someday being able to, like, make artificial wombs and not eating women.
Yeah, and in fact, we kind of didn't talk about it in the earlier chapters, but I mean, we saw it a little bit when she was talking about mother's feminized phallus or father's castrated femme, right? She wants to say, I mean, she makes another correct critique, which is psychoanalysis blames everything on the mother. And like we saw that in our Shane Wolf episode, like there's constantly just like and instead of saying, oh, maybe actually we need to look beyond just it's all the mother's fault and look at, you know, other factors of the person's life and society, right, all these things, she's like, oh, it's really the father and the surgeon, the transsexual, you know, the surgeon who is giving sex surgery or, you know, who's performing these surgeries is a kind of father, right? It's a dominating father, and they're living out the male fantasy of getting rid of women.
The father is symbolically becoming a woman by giving birth to this transsexual.
Exactly.
Oh my god.
So that's the goal of the game. It's extremely paranoid.
This is so feverish. I'm losing my fucking mind here.
And I mean, we've talked about going forward in time and seeing the way that things have changed and seeing how she's totally not been borne out. But this is something you can go back to, like one of the very first surgeries in like that Magnus Hirschfeld's clinic did in Weimar, Germany, like a trans woman walked into the clinic with a gun in her pocket and said, give me an orchiectomy right now or I'm going to blow my brains out.
Cool.
Yeah, this whole paranoid thing, like we have actual history just directly contradicting this.
Women are so powerful.
Yeah, to summarize all of this, basically, right, we've seen that she has like latched onto a problem. And again, like we've seen this a lot, like she notices something in society that's bad and at some points like comes really close to making a good critique and then just swerves. So I have two sort of short examples of this.
The process of the de-ethicization of behavior by psychology and psychiatry has particular relevance for discussions of transsexualism and the consequences which follow. By attributing transsexualism to biological or psychological causes, scientists, as stated previously, are conveying that there are only two choices. 1. Adjustment to one's body role, or 2. Surgery and counseling to transform one's body and role. In effect, both of these choices are biomedical. Choice number 1 adds up to biology as destiny, and choice number 2 states that, this failing, hormonal and possibly surgical treatment, contingent upon one's passing, of course, are indicated.
Right, and she goes on to say, and so because both of these choices are so constrained, like neither is a real choice, and so there isn't actually autonomy for transsexuals. And this is kind of true. Like what she's saying is this medicalized version, this medical model for transition that existed at the time where you need to prove that you can pass to get surgery or adjust to your body are both versions of biological essentialism. And it's like, yeah, that's a good critique, but you think that you should just make the first one better? You should just adjust to your body role, but in a woke way, right? It's like you've actually opened up this contradiction and then you're saying, okay, let's do the first one. Right? It doesn't really answer it at all. And in fact, she she really gets so close to the point. This one drove me actually insane.
We might say that the body is part of the creative ground of existence, but we are not bound by that structure in the full creative sense. Our spirit is bound to our bodies as its creative ground, but surpasses it through freedom and choice. The body is present in all our choices, but as total persons, we have the freedom to be other than what culturally accompanies a male or female body.
Yeah.
Literally the next sentence is, therefore transsexuals shouldn't get surgery. And it's like, what? Like,
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Like, she is coming close. She has all the pieces to make the correct conclusion here, right? Like, we've seen these cracks appearing with, like, what's going on. The question then is, why was Janice Raymond blinded? Why did she not see the obvious solution that transsexuals should just be feminists like all other women? Like, that's the solution. What did she miss?
So she added, at the end, she went back and inserted a chapter. And this chapter is the one that most often gets quoted when people talk about this book. Sappho by Surgery, the Transsexually Constructed Lesbian Feminist.
Oh, great. I'm so excited.
Yeah, the inclusion of this chapter, this really does betray what her motive is and explains where her argument goes wrong. It's also where her paranoia is made most apparent.
Yeah, it's really awkwardly shoved into the book. She opens chapter 5 by saying, okay, now continuing what I was saying in chapter 3. Like, it really is this paranoid fever dream that just arrives in the book and is like, oh, this really illuminates all these tensions we've been already noticing.
While regarded by many as an obscure issue that affects a relatively minute proportion of the population, transsexualism poses very important feminist questions. Transsexually constructed lesbian feminists show yet another face of patriarchy. As the male-deconstructed female transsexual exhibits the attempt to possess women in a bodily sense while acting out the images into which men have molded women, the male-deconstructed female who claims to be a lesbian feminist attempts to possess women at a deeper level, this time under the guise of challenging rather than conforming to the role and behavior of stereotyped femininity.
Yeah, so she's very clear, like, this consciousness-raising thing, this idea of, like, trans women getting together and talking to each other and becoming feminists, like, if the outcome of that is that they become feminists who want to advocate for feminism, that's actually even worse somehow. Like, somehow that's even worse.
And I think something to highlight here is that this is not abstract at all. So I didn't include the excerpt because I thought it was kind of grotesque. But the first footnote in this chapter is a whole page long, and it's about Sandy Stone. There's this whole page where she's just, here's a specific trans woman who was working at this feminist, like, recording company, and I hate her. I hate her so goddamn much, is basically what this footnote says. And, you see this again, parallel to the modern tactic of singling out an individual trans woman for coordinated harassment. Like, there's this big case recently in the UK where this doctor, Beth Upton, was just hounded out of her job with a combination of, like, some transphobic nurse making complaints, and then, like, the court system and the media kind of picking up on it, was this coordinated harassment campaign. And so this book is part of a coordinated harassment campaign against Sandy Stone.
So, yeah, this is one of the most famous sort of parts of this book that often gets quoted.
All transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves. However, the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist violates women's sexuality and spirit as well. Rape, although it is usually done by force, can also be accomplished by deception. It is significant that in the case of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, often he is able to gain entrance and a dominant position in women's spaces because the women involved do not know he is a transsexual, and he just does not happen to mention it. The question of deception must also be raised in the context of how transsexuals who claim to be lesbian feminists obtain surgery in the first place. Since all transsexuals have to pass as feminine in order to qualify for surgery, so-called lesbian feminist transsexuals either had to lie to the therapists and doctors, or they had a conversion experience after surgery. I am highly dubious of such conversions, and the other alternative, deception, raises serious problems, of course. What do you mean, of course? I think it's actually fucking base that trans women are lying to their doctors. That's like incredibly important.
Sarah, the problems are so obvious that it's not even worth listing one.
Yeah, so there's this, this thing about this deception we talked about earlier, like there's a certain role you have to fulfill, and so you have to lie if you don't fill this role. And rather than taking this as like, oh, this is a way in which these people are like harmed or exploited by this medical system, it's a sign of their untrustworthiness. You can't trust these transsexually constructed lesbian feminists because they had to lie to their surgeon. It's just fucking absurd.
Yeah, and she's supposedly against the medical establishment. She's supposedly like, oh, these people are demonstrating like incredible coercive power over these people and manipulating them into being transgender. But then the second she has evidence that a trans person lied, she's like, you fucking snakes. How dare you do this to your noble, fine doctors? You bastards.
Yeah, so the animosity, like the vitriol here against trans women, especially trans lesbians, I think is just apparent, right? Like, it's, her careful, like, scholarly pose in the other chapters is slipping. Her conspiracy theorism, which we've also seen, is also really shining through in this chapter.
Yeah, she has this obsession throughout the book that really rises to a fever pitch here with, like, historical, like, eunuchs. And so that's what she's going to talk about here.
Furthermore, the deceptiveness of men without members, that is, castrated men or eunuchs, has historical precedent. Oh my god, this is so fucking funny. We're really going here? We're really doing this?
Oh yeah.
There's a long tradition of eunuchs who were used by rulers, heads of state, and magistrates as keepers of women. Eunuchs were supervisors of the harem in Islam and wardens of women's apartments in many royal households. In fact, the word eunuch, from the Greek eunuchos, literally means keeper of the bed. Eunuchs were men that other more powerful men used to keep their women in place. By fulfilling this role, eunuchs also succeeded in winning the confidence of the ruler and securing important and influential positions. Moreover, the word eunuch is also related to the word scheme. Eunuchs scheme to obtain political power. That's where I thought we were heading, the fucking scheming vizier. This is so funny. In Mesopotamia, many eunuchs became royal officers and managers of palaces, and others emerge on the pages of history as important and often virile figures. Some were famous warriors and statesmen, as well as scholars. One finds eunuchs associated with temples dedicated to the goddesses from at least 2000 BC until well into the Roman period. In fact, the earliest mention of eunuchs is in connection with the Minoan civilization of Crete, which was a transitional period from an earlier gynocentric society. It thus appears that eunuchs, to some extent, always attached themselves to women's spaces, and, most frequently, were used to supervise women's freedom of movement, and to harness women's self-centeredness and self-government. Quote, "It is stated that entree into every political circle was possible for eunuchs, even if barred to other men." End quote. Will the acceptance of transsexually constructed lesbian feminists who have lost only their outward appendages of physical masculinity lead to the containment and control of lesbian feminists? Will every lesbian feminist space become a harem? Like eunuchs, transsexuals have gained prominent and dominant access to feminist political circles, quote, barred to other men, end quote. Just because transsexually constructed lesbian feminists are not only castrated men, but have also acquired artifacts of a woman's body and spirit, does not mean that they are unmen, and that they cannot be used as keepers of woman-identified women when the real men, the rulers of patriarchy, decide that the women's movement, used here as both noun and verb, should be controlled and contained. In this way, they too can rise in the kingdoms of the fathers. The political implications of historical eunuchism and its potential for female control should not be lost upon woman-identified women.
Someone should write about this castration anxiety phenomenon. I feel like there's something there.
Oh,
I've never heard anyone examine that before.
I just came up with it. It's my OC, do not steal. I mean, this is hilarious. Like, there's not really much to say, but I just want to point out that what is her modern day, like, eunuch managing this harem of the Sultan or whatever Orientalist thing she's going on? It's a sound engineer at a feminist recording studio. Like,
yeah, just some random person. Yeah, I mean, when you see libs of TikTok post a video of some random trans person being like, these are the people who are scheming to groom your children, like, that person is generally just some low-level functionary, like a teacher or some shit, not a person of power. Also, I'm sorry, I'm never going to be able to get the phrase the word eunuch is also related to the word scheme out of my head. That is so fucking funny. I'm surprised there isn't a little illustration in the book of like a nasty transsexual with like a bunch of stubble and stuff just like wringing their hands and plotting.
Yeah, and again, I think it's, we mentioned it quickly, but the Orientalism here, this extremely racialized analysis where it's like, oh, you should be thinking about the scary harems of the Muslims. And
right.
It's so gross.
Yeah, so it is gross. And it's kind of the other chapters are coherent, but it's falling apart here, right? Like, so there's actually my favorite part in this chapter is she cites a short story in Penthouse magazine. We all know Penthouse, like pornographic magazine. She cites this story in Penthouse to illustrate how transsexually constructed lesbian feminists infiltrate women's spaces. I'm not going to read it. Like, if you want to, you can find the book and read it. It's kind of gross. And then at another point, like, she's just reduced to raw assertion.
We know that we are women who are born with female chromosomes and anatomy, and that whether or not we were socialized to be so-called normal women, patriarchy has treated and will treat us like women. Transsexuals have not had this same history. No man can have the history of being born and located in this culture as a woman. He can have the history of wishing to be a woman and of acting like a woman, but this gender experience is that of a transsexual, not of a woman. Surgery may confer the artifacts of outward and inward female organs, but it cannot confer the history of being born a woman in this society.
Yeah, she's just reduced to just saying, like, yeah, like, we just know that we're different, and I don't have to explain it. It's just not a very scholarly pose. Like, in the rest of this, she's trying to explain this, and here she's just, like, raw assertion.
And as you pointed out at the beginning, Sarah, like, she's talking about these interviews, and she's talking about, one of the things she talks about in her interviews with trans women is this, oh, how do they know they're women? They're always going to these, they're either saying these stereotyped things or they're just asserting it as like something they know. And it's like, yeah, you are doing the exact same thing, right? Like, imagine this answer to how do you know you're a woman being given like in the interview of just saying like, oh, I just know that I am. Like, that's exactly the thing that she completely discredits. So it's a raw assertion that just demonstrates exactly that she has decided to see this from the beginning, and there's nothing you can say that will change her mind. There's no actual analysis happening.
Yeah, and I think so. One more excerpt to kind of illustrate the level of analysis in this chapter.
In the final analysis, transsexually constructed lesbian feminists are in the same tradition as the man-made, made-up lesbians of the Playboy centerfolds. Every so often, Playboy and similar magazines feature a Sappho pictorial. Recently, male photographers have entered the book market by portraying pseudo-lesbians in all sorts of positions, clothing, and contexts that could only be fantasized by a male mind. In short, the manner in which women are depicted in these photographs mimics the poses of men pawing women. Men produce lesbian love the way they want it to be, and according to their own canons of what they think it should be. Transsexually constructed lesbian feminists are in this tradition of pseudo-lesbian propaganda. Both the Playboy pseudo-lesbian and the transsexual pseudo-lesbian spread the correct, read male-defined, image of the lesbian, which in turn filters into public consciousness through the mass media as truth. By thus mutilating the true self-definition of the lesbian, men mold her image/reality according to their own. As Lisa Buck has commented, transsexualism is truly their word made flesh.
Elsewhere, in these other chapters, this empire and transsexual empire is the medical psychiatric establishment. These are the fathers producing these, male to constructed female transsexuals. Here in this chapter, she's continually like bringing up pornographic magazines, Penthouse, Playboy, and so on. And, you look at her subtitle, The Making of the She-Male, you get the impression she really does view she-males as pornographic.
And this is something that has direct political ramifications, too. The implication that transsexuals are, by their nature, at every moment, existing as sexual objects and projecting, like, a sexual image out onto the world, that we're sort of like radioactive rocks radiating sexuality, is something that is really important to conservatives' efforts to denigrate us as, like, groomers, etc., and control our public appearance. Because existing norms around what is controllable about public displays of sexuality then become applied to just our everyday life, become applied to me buying lemons at the grocery store or whatever. Suddenly that's a sexual act.
You see this, for example, like Texas has this drag ban, right? You can't do drag performances where there's children around. You look at how the legislation is written, drag performance just includes anything a trans woman does, or for that matter, a trans man.
Yeah, and in fact, she even talks about this a little bit elsewhere in the book, where she talks about, like, all sorts of laws against cross-dressing. And she says, look, there's all these laws that, like, sex workers who are doing deception, there's laws against that, but then it's just used to pick up people who are just wearing whatever clothing that's not, gender conforming on the street. And that's bad. We should only be arresting people when there's fraud involved. So she really, like, again, she's getting close to this point of seeing, like, oh, if you try to, like, legally say this is, fraud or this deception, like, she understands that this is a method of control, but yeah, she just thinks that this is a porn category, right? She thinks that trans people are just a porn category.
We kind of said a lot about what Janice Raymond thinks, and I think it's only fair to give her the last word.
Yeah, so here's what she has to say on kind of how she wants her book to be taken, what the point of all of this was. This is sort of very much a conclusion in a way.
It is my deepest hope that this book will not be viewed as an unsympathetic treatment of the anguish and existential plight of the transsexual. What I have tried to present is a different vision of where to focus sympathy and sensitivity. You lying motherfucker. Oh my god.
Yeah, like, she's just gotten through talking about these deceptive transsexuals who are lying to society and lying to things. Actually, a lot of this chapter, a lot of the Sappho by surgery chapter and, like, the ways in which it's conspiratorial, she even comes out right and says, and she's like, oh, it's like, it's a mystery. Like, why are so many, basically cis lesbians accepting trans women in their ranks? And she has to just completely reject the possibility that, being a lesbian is a sexual orientation and cis lesbians can find trans women hot because trans women are women. That has to be totally out of bounds of possibility. And so she's just painted this whole conspiratorial, paranoid thing with talking about scheming eunuchs, and now she's like, but that I'm sympathetic. I just, I just want us to be more thoughtful about the ways in which we're sympathetic.
These are our future overseers and the Muslim harems, and they're raping us just by existing, and I'm so scared of them. And also, I'm really trying to be empathic here. I'm just saying, like, oh man, things suck for them, and we got to understand how to focus our sympathy correctly.
Returning to the theme of, like, how what you see in modern day, like, organized transphobia is also present in this book, is you do see the same sort of rhetorical move. Someone will just, like, we need to mandate this out of existence, like, they're grooming our children, all these, like, things, and this, like, present this also, no, but, like, I'm, like, I don't have anything against them. Like, I'm really simple. I just don't think it should happen to children or in public or...
I mean, it is just sort of tying into this reactionary bent and this reactionary current, and we've seen ways in which these people are sort of just accessing, all of our episode subjects in some way are just accessing some kind of ambient bigotry and sort of amplifying it. But this text itself was really influential, and lots of texts during sort of big arguments in the 80s will reference it, and people, on both sides of this argument. And
well, and you'll see, like, these ideas just repeated without, like, citation. So, I don't know, maybe this ends up getting clipped, but a good example of this would be, like, Bell Hook's take on the film Paris is Burning is just straight out of Janice Raymond. just the same sort of critique of drag and transsexuality as this, like, with men taking on, like, this performance of women.
Where does Janice Raymond go with her career after this?
Okay, so that's a great transition, because that's... Okay, so for all that the transsexual empire had a lot of influence within academic feminism, I don't think it's her materially most influential work. So I would argue, her most influential work was this report, quote, Technology on the Social and Ethical Aspects of Transsexual Surgery. This was a report commissioned by the National Center for Healthcare Technology, part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So this was 1981. Based upon this report, they recommended public insurance not cover trans healthcare, so Medicaid, Medicare. A formal ban was put in place in 1989. Of course, many private insurers followed suit. Private insurers, if the government says you don't have to cover this, they'd love to have an excuse not to cover the surgery. And it wasn't until Obama in 2014 that this ban was overturned. So she's not trying to legally mandate things out of existence, she says, but the government shouldn't pay for it. I'm not trying to make abortion illegal. I just don't want my tax dollars going for it. Okay. But this isn't the only thing she's done. She's done more than get angry at transsexuals. So her other really two big passions, both of which are themes present in this, is she's really against sex work. She's done a lot of theoretical work about kind of trying to, the legal aspects of sex work and what I think a lot of people would call is like an anti-sex worker perspective. And her other big thing is on reproductive technology. So the medical ethics of things like surrogacy, embryo selection, things like that. She's very heavily against this. Again, she's very heavily against sort of like this medical establishment, psychiatric establishment.
Yeah, but she's kind of found her way back to anti-trans feminism more recently.
Sure. So as a coda, though, she's, like a lot of people, her dissertation work wasn't the main thing she did in her career, right? She mostly worked on this stuff about sex work and about reproductive technologies. But in her retirement, she has returned to an early interest, and her most recent book from a few years back is called Doublethink, A Feminist Challenge to Transgenderism. And I read through a bunch of it, and frankly, this book is more pathetic than anything else. So the transsexual empire is hugely influential, but modern-day anti-trans activism pretends that transsexualism was invented in 2014, right? If you think that transsexualism was invented in 2014, you can't admit your own intellectual history. So Janice Raymond has become a marginal figure in this movement that she wrote the Bible for. And there's a lot of funny things. There's a lot of grievance mongering in this book. She whines about her Wikipedia page. She complains that, the transsexual empire is available on Amazon, but it costs a lot of money because it's out of print. There's a section where she complains that, people say Andrea Dworkin stopped being transphobic, but actually her whole life she kept agreeing with me. It's just all these petty little things. My favorite, though, Sarah, maybe you want to read this, this is my favorite grievance she has in her book.
After 40-plus years of dissenting from transgender orthodoxies, I learned that the Women's Studies program, now renamed as Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, in which I taught for 28 years, had posted this message on its website. Given the persistence of legacies of trans-exclusionary radical feminism, including its presence in the history of women's studies at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and in response to requests for clarification on this issue from trans communities at UMass and in the Pioneer Valley, we categorically reject transphobia in our department, on our campus, and in our discipline. Oh, she got salty about that, I bet.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Pioneer Valley is a bit of a lesbian mecca. This is where, for example, Smith College is. It's, per capita, one of the queerest places in the country, and, kind of lesbians, gay men, bisexuals are generally pretty pro-trans people, especially compared to the cis-het population. And she's so upset at this. She's so upset that everyone around her just doesn't agree with her.
Do you remember that survey that's like, do you support trans women or something like that? And the survey responses are like 96% yes for trans women, like responding about themselves, and like 98% for cis lesbians.
It's the Helen effect, yes.
Yeah, I did a little bit of also like where is she now kind of research. I didn't go into this book at all, but I did find this like very funny podcast interview she did on a like right-wing feminist podcast, where it is two like right-wing, like it's a right-wing grifter basically, or it's two right-wing grifters, or, you know, but they're not synced up in the right way. So it's just like a really awkward interview to listen to, because the woman first is like, oh, your book came out in 1979, like that's the year I was born. And then it's just this really awkward moment where Janice Raymond is like, oh. And then the woman is like, yeah, and it's interesting, like your book is so relevant, but it's so hard to find. And Janice Raymond is like, and Janice Raymond goes, oh, it's available for free on my website. And so she's like inviting her to do the grievance politics of like, your book is hard to find. And then Janice Raymond is like missing the point. And
it's like, Janice, don't you understand that you're being canceled? That the man is like pushing you down?
Yeah. And they're just,
and Janice is like,
they're not on the same page.
You're saying my work is forgotten, and that.
Well, and to a large extent, her work is forgotten. She's a very marginal figure. You look at like who the big names are. None of them are Janice Raymond. None of them like really cite her. Again, they have to pretend that their movement isn't this old. But I think that we can synthesize the Janice Raymond work with modern feminist issues, and so I would like to propose a question for the two of you. Can bisexuals be transsexually constructed lesbian feminists? Yes or no?
Helen, you go first.
Hold on, I need to count something in my head. You can't spell transsexually constructed lesbian feminist without bisexual, I think. I think that it is all in there if you shuffle it around, so I'm going to go with yes.
Well, as a daughter of a woman and someone who's very fond of women, I have to say that it's very important that we keep women in our heart, that we keep bisexual women in our heart, that we keep surgically constructed transsexual androgynous Jesus pieces, or whatever the phrase is, in our heart. And so I care about that, and I'm going to keep supporting that, and that's my answer.
Yeah. At times I was reading this and I'm wondering, and especially as we're talking about it and saying this phrase over and over of the male deconstructed female, I'm like wondering if like she needed a phrase that long because she constantly wanted to just be saying tranny over and over. And so she needed like a tongue twister, like a kind of like a fidget, like just to kind of like get back into the headspace, right? These male to constructed female, these sexually constructed lesbian feminists, it's just so lame. It's so terrible. I really
regret committing to the bit of exclusively saying that, because it got really awful by the end. It's a terrible phrase.
Yeah, it feels really bad, especially once we're talking about like actual women. It's like, ugh.
All right, shall we do FAG ratings?
Before we get into FAG ratings, we wanted to give people some things to look at to go forward, because a lot of people have also responded to both Janice Raymond and also to the anti-trans movement in general. And so
there's some Trans Studies 101.
Yeah, so we had looked at some other sources to talk about, and then we didn't clip a lot from these other places, and we clipped a little bit from Empire Strikes Back. The work of Susan Stryker also is something we were thinking about a lot as we prep this episode. She talks a lot as well about trying to move away from a medically, like a purely medical model of transition, but not to say like don't go with surgery, but to say like instead of viewing this as some kind of like medical pathology, view it as an actual thing of autonomy and freedom.
A bit more contemporary there is the works of Andrea Long Chu, who's really leaned in this issue of like autonomy as being the basis for kind of like the politics or ethics of transsexuality.
Yeah, and then there's also Judith Butler's most recent book, Who's Afraid of Gender, which is a really good overview of contemporary anti-trans politics. So, on this podcast, we have a way of rating all of our subjects on a 3-point scale, an FAG scale, for their ferocity, their arrogance, and their gullibility.
And it's 1 to 5 for each of those 3 categories.
And we will allow ourselves to go to 6 if it seems like particularly exceptionally bad in some case, but usually we try to keep it 1 to 5 in general. So, for ferocity, where do we think this stands?
I'm kind of leaning towards a 3. To me, this is like the prototypical bigot coming out here. Someone who has an obsessive crank tendency, but who isn't totally willing to just demolish their own social standing and just go all out and be like, it's time for a tranny holocaust or something like that. To really get into like the higher ratings, I think I would need to see a little bit more from Janice. But I think a 3 is fair.
Yeah, I agree with that analysis. There's clearly like a lot of vitriol behind this, but for most of her book, she does keep the image of the feminist scholar.
Yeah. So, okay. So it seems like we're all going 3. I think that I would also agree with that. I'm a little tempted to go for 4 just because it is so explicitly misogynist and, right, I guess I'm thinking in my head, like, she's talking about, like, her view of what a woman is and women's role in society. She claims as a feminist one, but it's actually in a lot of ways very close to like Leacock's position on what a woman's role in society is. She sees this like very biologically determined, even though she claims that's not what it is, this very like natural law position for women. At times, I mean, this is also a theme we didn't really draw out, but we saw it in a lot of the excerpts. She does buy into a lot of this, like, women are secretly in charge, right? Like, why do, you know, why do trans women become lesbians, right? Why are there transsexually constructed lesbian feminists? It's because they recognize that, like, now women are secretly gaining power, or, you know, women are gaining power.
Especially
in the very
women.
first excerpt when she's talking about Renee Richards, she's like, oh, she hit the ball back into the male court because women were winning, right? Part of her whole analysis here is like women are winning the sex war, and so now this is the latest salvo from the men is these transsexuals. And so a lot of her analysis is, you know, we gave Leacock a 4, and she also has the weird sort of racial politics, but I do agree it's maybe not quite there, so I think I'll stick with 3 as well.
I think what you're talking about, Helen, though, is her arrogance rating. A lot of the stuff.
Yeah, I think where I'm going to go with is she's much closer to Leacock in arrogance, who we both gave a 5. I'm definitely giving her a 5 for arrogance. This is extremely arrogant, what she's written here.
No, I agree. Like, it's a big project. She's, like, purporting to give this, like, feminist analysis of transsexualism, and it's not very attuned to nuance, I would say.
We didn't even actually clip. There's some parts that are even more, I think, lazily written, which would up the arrogance for me. In the introduction, when she's talking about why, or maybe it's chapter 1, but when she's talking about like why she chooses transsexualism and this notion of ideology, she literally has a section where she says, Webster's dictionary defines ideology as, and then she does the other, she does a dictionary citation one more time, and she's like, oh, the dictionary defines like male as, you know, like a protruding thing to fit into a hollowed out, right? In the sense of like, you know, wood carve, you know, whatever, like a male to female, like electrical cord. And she's like, oh, and so this is why I call the transsexually constructed lesbian feminists male, is because they are protruding into the hollowed out, you know, lesbian feminist activism, right? Like she's doing this really lazy, arrogant, just here's what the dictionary says, and secretly that's what's really going on. It's
so Helen, can I correct your terminology there? I believe you meant to say a male to constructed female transsexual electrical cord.
Yeah, male to constructed female electrical cord. Oh my god.
I think I'm gonna settle on a 3 for her. To me, she has. You were describing her laziness, and I would describe her as exactly at the level of arrogance I associate with just a lazy academic. And that is like a meaningful amount. Remember, like a 1 on our scale is not like a normal person necessarily. But I think that lands at about a 3 for me.
I'm in the middle and I would put her at 4.
Okay. Gullibility is interesting. And so this is one where really what we want to rank with gullibility is each of our subjects, you know, if we're talking about the production of bigotry, each of our subjects has some role in the production of bigotry. And how aware is the subject of what their role is, where a higher gullibility means that they're less aware. They're sort of more just being used by forces that they're not aware of, versus like how aware are they of what they're trying to do.
I'd rank her quite low, and I think part of this is this report I mentioned she wrote for the HHS. She knowingly collaborated with this right-wing Reagan administration to get the government to stop funding trans healthcare. This is not someone who's unaware what her role in the production of bigotry is. This is someone who's happy to do it.
Yeah, I think the only thing that raises it slightly for me is her seemingly genuine confusion about why cis lesbians might be attracted to trans women. And I think this is tied into more broadly her conviction. And this isn't just her, this is something that is like, and still persists to this day, this vision of like lesbian as not only a sexual orientation, but as like a broader political movement, as being like, oh, we're a lesbian in the sense of not only being with women, but, you know, rejecting men in male society. And actually something we didn't talk about in the consciousness raising therapy section, she's talking about peer support. She has this idea that, oh, what feminists recognize is that actually, you know, peers should support each other, and what the feminist movement realizes is that men and women are not peers, and so women should support each other because they're really peers. She has this whole thing that she seems to genuinely believe that, like, of political lesbianism, and then is, like, unable to understand that, like, no, actually, the primary motivation for lesbians is erotic because it's a sexual orientation. That might make it a 2 for me, but I don't think higher than a 2.
I agree with it too.
I think I'm going to go with a 1 on this. So my thinking here is that she's engaged in this larger political project, and she seems to understand herself as engaged in project building, which to some extent is an academic affectation. But I can kind of see the re-education programs or whatever that she's envisioning being set out like in this text. Like there are practical programs that she really wants this writing to create in the world. And I don't know. I'm unclear because this episode I think was a lot less biographical than many of our other episodes. So just going purely on vibes, I'm going to give it 1.
Okay. So that means that I gave her a 10, Julia, you gave her a 9, and Sarah, you gave her a 7. So fairly low overall, I think. And I think that's kind of fair. Like, this stuff is terrible, and I did want to throw the book, and I maybe did once or twice. But it's not... A lot of it is so boring. A lot of it is so lazy. It's so... I got mad at this news story of this trans woman who worked at a record company and then wrote a 200-page manifesto about, like, Dionysian confusion. Like,
The way it struck me when I first read this is I was like, this is obviously shoddy. This is obviously motivated by, like, personal bigotry and hate. How did anyone, like, take this seriously? How did anyone be like, oh yeah, this was a great work of feminist scholarship. I want to cite it in my own book that I write 5-10 years later. Just... it's transparently shit.
Yeah, and I think that's another part where her gullibility is low, is not only did she collaborate with the government in these ways, but also, I mean, she set out to change feminist discourse, and she largely did, right? Like, even though, as we're saying, it's not good, and if you read it, it's like, this doesn't make sense. Nonetheless, she had the effect she kind of explicitly set out to have, which is to make this a main current of feminist thought. Maybe not the main current, but certainly a major one at the time.
We should try doing good bigoted works at some point.
I actually thought going into prepping this, not more recently, but a couple months ago when I first conceived this episode, I sort of had higher hopes for this on the level of craft, because it opens maybe with some of her strongest stuff. And I thought, okay, this will be interesting because she is taking the time to do this analysis. And a lot of this in today in contemporary discourse gets just put into, you know, an Atlantic piece or some even shorter opinion column or a blog post or a post on Mumsnet, which, like, I think she's posting on Mumsnet now. Like, I think that's part of what, because she's certainly, like, in that crowd. And so I thought, okay, there's some argument here. There's something to look at. She's trained as an academic. She'll be able to, like, lay out an argument, and it'll be bad and terrible ideologically. But I was a little bit surprised by how shoddily written it is, especially once you leave the introduction, and it just totally falls apart.
I know it doesn't benefit the world really in any way, but I'm glad that she's suffering narcissistic injury and obscurity. Warms my heart. Okay, well, that's our episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Julia for guesting. Thank you to Helen for being lovely. And you can go to our Patreon, patreon.com/Odium Symposium, and subscribe for early episodes, etc., etc., etc. But also, what would be really nice would be if you rated us on your podcast app of choice, if you told your friends about us. We don't know how to market. We're lazy and a little bit thick, and so we're kind of hoping you do it for us. All right, bye, guys.
Bye.
Ciao.
There's really nothing real. There is no real. And that's what's called the postmodern mentality.
I couldn't resist the worst racist remark.
The adventure of life justifies its suffering.
I don't want to see him having political succubus with goblins.
We'll do it live.
Is Trump going to have babies with a goblin?
We'll do it live.
And turn against us like Darth Vader?
Do it live.
Now listen, you
The
queer,
right of
I'll
calling
slap
names
you in
and
your
let's get-
goddamn face, and you'll stay plastered.
I was going to have a guest speaker, but the person I had invited in died.
Some level of masochism.